What's up, guys? We're back and we're breaking down UFC 283 Teixeira versus Hill. But before we get any further, I do want to address the status and the future of the podcast. Some of you may or may not have already noticed I missed last week's Fight Night card, and unfortunately going forward, I don't think I'll be able to consistently upload like I have been the past couple of years. Long story short, I've gotten a lot more work and family obligations, so I just don't have as much time as I did to really dive deep into matchups, do all the tape and the notes and the recording and editing. In any case, I do actually enjoy breaking down these fights. I do still enjoy watching the fights. So I'll try and pop in every so often to break the cards down, likely for some of the major pay-per-view cards, potentially some of the bigger Fight Night cards like the international ones. I may also just do some uploads for maybe just some main cards or just individual matchups I'm very interested in. I have no idea. I'll have to play it by ear. But in any case, I have really appreciated all of the love and support so far. As long as people are listening, I'll probably still do uploads, just not as consistently or as frequently as I used to. So with that out of the way, let's get right into what you guys are really here for, and that's the breakdowns for UFC 283 Teixeira versus Hill. Let's go. All right, so this is probably not going to be the first fight of the card. I'm just going off of Tapology here, but according to Tapology, I have Bruno Ferreira versus Gregory Rodrigues. Rodrigues is the minus 330 favorite. Ferreira is the plus 270 underdog, and honestly, I don't have too much to say about this fight. We have one of many fights where we have a newcomer coming in against an established UFC fighter. So Rodrigues obviously going to be the guy with a lot more UFC experience, the guy who I think is a lot more well-rounded, as well, a lot more skilled overall. Rodrigues, he's a pretty heavy-handed fighter, a very competent submission grappler as well. He's been in the octagon with some pretty good UFC-level fighters. He's beaten some notable guys in the division as well. His only loss is to Petrosian, who he arguably beat. So an argument can be made that Rodrigues is undefeated in the division. I mean, it was a very close fight regardless, and I do think that Petrosian's a pretty legit striker. In any case, Rodrigues is going to have, I think, a lot of the advantages here in terms of skill and the experience level. Ferreira, on the other hand, he's coming in short notice, but outside of him being a very dangerous, explosive striker, I really don't know too much about this guy. He's got, very explosive striking, and he's got a ton of early finishes. How he's going to look beyond that first round and a half, I have no idea. Maybe he's able to knock Rodrigues out. For a while, Rodrigues, the chin was a concern, mainly stemming from, I think, the Jordan Williams fight. But in hindsight, it definitely looks like it may have just been an anomaly, since Williams hasn't won a fight since, and Rodrigues has taken some pretty big shots from guys like Petrosian and Chidi and Jokwani, and has been able to fight through it. So I don't think his chin is as bad as I had initially thought it was, but it is still going to be pretty scary going up against a guy in Ferreira. So with all that said, though, I think Rodrigues obviously still is the side here. He's the one coming in on a full camp. I think he's got a much more well-rounded skill set. He's much more battle-tested. So I got to side with Rodrigues here. The minus 340 is a little scary for a guy who, has eaten a few big shots in his career against a very explosive guy in Ferreira, but I got to go with Rodrigues here. I think he gets it done by round 2 knockout. That first round could be a little dicey for both guys, but I see Rodrigues really start to pick it up. I think Ferreira's going to start to slow down in that second round, and we see Rodrigues pick up an attritional TKO in that second round. So give me Rodrigues by round 2 knockout. So up next we have Thiago Moisés versus Melquizael Costa, and this is another fight where we have another newcomer up against another established UFC fighter. I don't even know if you'd consider Moisés a vet at this point. I think he's had quite a number of fights, so he's actually been around for a little while now, and he's actually faced some pretty decent guys. But Costa, on the other hand, is going to be making his UFC debut, and on short notice too. But from what I have seen from him so far, it does look like Costa's primarily a striker. He does look pretty dynamic on the feet, likes to pressure opponents, attack all 3 levels. He does mix in the spinning attacks, and he's pretty relentless with the pressure. But coming in on short notice against a pretty well-rounded fighter in Moisés, I think this is going to be a pretty tough fight for Costa. Moisés obviously is a fantastic grappler, but not exactly the most reliable to go there. Obviously he did go to it his last fight against Giagos, but historically he has kind of had a habit of just letting fights play out on the feet, and with, pretty varied success. The issue that I do have with Moisés standing is he can be a little low volume. He can get backed up. He can be a bit passive at times. He has a tendency to just kind of shell up at times against the cage. So, it's kind of bad optics, and, he's just not a fantastic minute winner. But, he did show a lot of aggression in his last fight, and he still is a pretty young fighter. So I feel like that is something that could definitely be improved in his game, and potentially is improving. And going into this fight, I feel like Moisés is probably going to look to grapple here. I feel like he should have a decent edge in the grappling department. Just watching, I think, Costa's most recent loss, I think he did lose the fight because he was giving up some pretty crucial takedowns. He didn't get absolutely washed or anything there. And I felt like it was actually a pretty competitive fight that he could have won, but I feel like there were a few moments in that fight that, he gave up a couple crucial takedowns and gave up a bit of control time, which may have kind of sealed the deal for him. And, that's just some random guy on the regionals. So if that guy's doing that, I feel like Moisés can probably have a little more success there. So official pick, I got to go with Moisés in this spot. He's still a very young fighter. He's making improvements fight to fight. He's got way more UFC experience. He's way more proven at this point. It's kind of hard not to pick him in the spot, and I feel like he should have a decent advantage if this fight were to hit the ground. So official pick for this fight, I'm going to go with Moisés to win by round 2 submission. The line's not out yet, but I have a feeling they're probably going to open it with Moisés being at least like minus 250 or so. It's really tough to, pick these guys coming in on short notice against these, pretty established guys. If Moisés does let this fight play out standing, though, he could be in a bit of trouble. Costa, he does bring a good amount of volume and aggression. But I do think that Moisés, if he's smart, he's going to look to implement the grappling here. So give me Moisés by round 2 submission. And moving along, we have Daniel Marcos versus Saimon Oliveira. And Oliveira is the minus 160 favorite. Marcos is the plus 140 underdog. And this is a pretty low-level fight here. Marcos, he is making his UFC debut. Oliveira's got one fight at the UFC level, so he's going to be in his second fight right now. But this is, I think, a striker versus grappler matchup. I don't think there's a ton of layers to this fight. If I'm being honest, I think that Marcos is going to be the better striker here. He's a guy who's got a lot of forward pressure. Not the most technical guy in there, but he does have power. The cardio seems decent. He did come off of a pretty longish layoff, but did look, decent on the Contender Series. And now he's making his debut against Saimon Oliveira, who is a guy who's pretty reckless on the feet. He's usually just looking to strike to close the distance and get his hands on you, try and hit you with the guillotine. And it does appear that Oliveira is kind of a guillotine or bust sort of guy. He does seem to really hunt it. He tries to force it in a lot of his fights, but if it doesn't happen, he does seem to be a little lost out there. We did see him attack it pretty aggressively against Gravely in his UFC debut. Looked like he might have come close to it in that first round, but wasn't able to convert, and kind of was lost after that point, right? Was kind of just stuck on his back. Wasn't able to really get much off in terms of offense. And, it really wasn't a great look seeing him just get completely top time for Gravely, or by Gravely for 3 rounds. And, Gravely, he is a solid fighter. He's a good wrestler. But for a guy who's typically kind of gassy to look like he's got decent cardio against you, just not a very good look. Obviously, you can't look too much into that matchup. It's a very different stylistic matchup. Gravely, a very, explosive wrestler. Marcos, on the other hand, more of a striker. But I do think that on the feet, Marcos should have the advantage, or Marcos should have the advantage here. I feel like he's the guy that's likely to win minutes and potentially even have the knockout upside. Oliveira, obviously, he's got a very dangerous guillotine, but I feel like if he isn't able to convert, he's going to be in a bit of trouble here. And between the two, I do kind of favor the cardio of Marcos a bit more. So official pick for this fight, I'm going to go with Daniel Marcos here to pick up the round 2 knockout. I think we see Oliveira maybe have some success early in the fight, but I feel like as the fight starts to draw on, we start to see Oliveira tire a little bit, and we see Marcos be able to find the finish. So give me Marcos by round 2 knockout. And next up, we have Cody Stamann versus Luan Lacerda. And Stamann's the minus 330 favorite. Lacerda's the plus 270 underdog. And so we have Lacerda, the newcomer, the debutant against the veteran in Stamann. And I feel like out of all the matchups where we have a newcomer against a veteran, this might be one of the more interesting and compelling matchups, even though there is a big experience discrepancy between the two. So Stamann, obviously the more tenured fighter here, a guy who's quite well-rounded, I'd say. His boxing's pretty serviceable. Not the most power or anything, but he does have pretty good volume. And, of course, he does have the wrestling in his back pocket. He's got solid cardio. He's been around. He's been in there with some pretty good guys. Lacerda, on the other hand, coming into the UFC 12-1, largely a finisher on the regionals and really hasn't faced too many people of note. And on top of that, he does appear to be a somewhat one-dimensional fighter in that he appears to largely be a submission specialist. On the feet, he's kind of low volume, a little counter-heavy, if I'm being honest, and just not a very great minute winner. I feel like his shots are pretty telegraphed as well. And as far as this matchup is concerned, he's probably going to have a pretty hard time taking a guy like Stamann down, who's got pretty good takedown defense and is a fantastic wrestler himself. But with Lacerda, this guy, he does have pretty insanely long arms, at least according to Tapology. I don't know how accurate it is because it does seem pretty insane here. It says he's got a 73-inch reach, but he's only 5'7", so if those measurements are true, that's actually pretty nutty. But in any case, Lacerda, he is pretty crafty on the mat, and that combined with his long arms and the leverage he could probably get from it, he can definitely snatch up a pretty sneaky submission, which does make this matchup so compelling because on the feet, while I do think that Stamann is likely the better boxer, he's going to have to get past the length of Lacerda, and I feel like that can be tricky, even if it is against potentially an inferior striker. And Stamann, I do think he's the better wrestler as well, but you do have to wonder going into this matchup how willing he is to wrestle against a guy in Lacerda who is as dangerous as he is on the mat. So it does make for a very interesting dynamic between the two. But ultimately, I think the safe pick is Stamann. You got to go with the guy who has kind of proven himself at the UFC level. He's proven to be pretty tough. A guy who can push it for 3 rounds. If his submission defense is on point, he could probably get a bit of top time as well. So I think you got to go with Stamann in terms of the volume, in terms of his minute-winning ability. But stylistically, I think that this is not as easy of a fight as the line would indicate. In fact, it really seems like a very high-risk, low-reward sort of fight for Stamann. He's fighting not just way down the rankings, he's fighting a complete newcomer, despite, being a pretty established guy himself. So I am going to pick him to win, and he's likely going to do it by decision, like he usually does, but I honestly may end up with a small bet on Lacerda by submission or something, just because he does appear to be a pretty crafty submission grappler, and if Stamann's not careful with his takedown entries, he could very well just, get caught in a guillotine or something. So, give me Stamann here by decision, but I am looking at the Lacerda submission prop. And next up, we have Warlley Alves versus Nicolas Dalby, and Dalby's the minus 135 favorite. Alves is the plus 115 underdog. And this is a pretty interesting fight between a couple of guys who've kind of been around now. Interestingly, though, Alves is going to be the much, much younger guy, which I think may be a factor here. But with Alves, he is, I'd say, a pretty dangerous fighter. He's very explosive on the feet, lots of just big single strikes, an explode and reload type of guy. He does have a pretty dangerous guillotine as well. If guys are hurt and they're shooting a sloppy takedown on him, he will look to capitalize. But Alves, he has kind of struggled a bit in fights that do get extended. And Alves, he's going to be up against Dalby, who's a bit of a karate fighter, likes to bounce in and out of the pocket, likes to touch opponents at distance, really work the kicks. But overall, not a particularly dangerous guy, in my opinion. And I do think there are holes in Dalby's game. His takedown defense, not particularly great. His bottom game, not really good either. And on top of that, I feel like Dalby's chin is a little shaky. I wouldn't say he's chinny per se, but I do think that he's someone who can get cracked in there. And, he is getting a little up there in age, which definitely doesn't help at all. He is coming off of a win, but it wasn't really that impressive of a performance in my opinion. He still gave up a lot of takedowns to a 40-year-old. Claudio Silva still gave up a lot of control time to him. And I feel like the wrestling is something that Alves can potentially mix in. Alves not like a guy who's going to spam takedowns in there, but it is something he has in his arsenal. He has, shown he could hit takedowns. He could rack up some control time. So I think that is a path for Alves. On top of that, I do think that Alves could probably land something big on the feet as well. The footwork and movement of Dalby may be able to give Alves some trouble, but I really don't think Dalby's some very defensive guy either, right? He's been cracked on the feet before, despite all the movement, and I feel like Alves is quick and explosive enough to definitely time and land something big on Dalby. So I do like Alves in this spot. I feel like he's got a few paths to victory here. I think he can absolutely land something big. I think he could also mix in enough wrestling and grappling to win some minutes as well. So official pick for this fight, I am going to go with Alves, and I'll actually take him to win by round 1 submission. I think it'll probably be a club and sub scenario where he does have Dalby hurt. Dalby's going to dive in for a reactive takedown or something and just get guillotined by Alves. So official pick, I'll go with Alves to win by round 1 submission. And up next we have Jailton Almeida versus Shamil Abdurakhimov, and Almeida's the minus 900 favorite. Abdurakhimov's the plus 600 underdog. And it looks like the UFC really does want this fight to happen. I think it's been rebooked 2 or 3 times now, and they're definitely not letting Abdurakhimov off the hook here. So obviously, I think they're pretty intent on feeding him to the prospect here in Jailton, and it seems like Jailton's pretty content to just cash these checks at heavyweight. But I think I've already broken this fight down. I think a ton of people have broken this fight down a number of times already before, so I'll just be quick with it. Obviously, the line's pretty insane. We're getting Jailton at almost minus 1,000 here, but at the end of the day, Abdurakhimov is an aging fighter at the tail end of his career. I'd say his takedown defense was never really that good. On top of that, he's just been really inactive, whereas with Jailton, he's been riding a ton of hype, a ton of momentum. The size could be an issue, but the fact is, he does have technically the measurable advantage, and most of these heavyweights are pretty bloated up light heavyweights either. And I believe a lot of people said that about Parker Porter, and he was able to handle Parker Porter without much trouble. Abdurakhimov is going to be a pretty big guy himself, but let's be real. Abdurakhimov is kind of rotund and not exactly, the biggest heavy or the most imposing heavyweight, I should say. But ultimately, I do think that we see Jailton hit takedowns here. I don't know if he's going to be able to find the submission. I think it may just come down to how much fight Abdurakhimov is going to have in him, how much resistance he really wants to put up. But in any case, if the submission doesn't materialize, I feel like Jailton will be able to rack up control time. The cardio may be a concern in future matchups, but I think it should be fine here. Abdurakhimov, he is an older fighter and, not exactly a cardio machine himself either. But realistically, the only way I think Almeida really loses this fight is if he just completely gasses himself out, hunting the submission, going for the ground and pound early, and isn't able to do anything come that second and third round. But I don't know how likely that is. I do think that we see Jailton, hit takedowns early and find the finish. If not, at least be able to ride out 2 of the 3 rounds. So official pick for this fight, I am going with Almeida, and I'll take him to win by round 2 submission. And in the next fight, we have Terrance McKinney versus Ismael Bonfim, and this is a pick'em fight, the first pick'em fight on the card here. Minus 110 both ways. So like any McKinney fight, this fight is likely going to be a banger, and that's because McKinney goes all out early. This guy really does not want to be in there any longer than he needs to be. He's a very explosive striker. He's looking to finish on the feet. He's going to look for these high-impact takedowns, and once he gets it to the ground, he's really going to look to just throw some really aggressive ground and pound, be very aggressive with the submission attempts. So it does make him super dangerous early, but it also drains the cardio very quickly. We've seen him gas out pretty badly in the second round, and sometimes even as early as the first round, and that's always going to be a concern on the McKinney side. But it does make him very, very dangerous early, and he is always super live to get the finish early in a fight. But this is a pretty intriguing matchup because he's up against Bonfim, who is making his UFC debut. And honestly, I think Bonfim looks decent on the feet, actually. He doesn't seem like a total scrub here. He's very pressure heavy, a little plotty. He likes to keep a nice, tight, high guard. Does seem a little slow, but it's kind of hard to tell. Just watching tape, you don't really ever know how quick a guy is until you actually see them match up. But I feel like between the two, McKinney's probably going to be the quicker, a little more explosive guy. But honestly, I'd like to have seen a little more from Bonfim in terms of how he's going to look when he's under fire, how he's going to look when he's going through a ton of adversity, because he likely will go through a lot of adversity early in this fight. He's probably going to have to eat some pretty big shots. He might get taken down. He might get ground and pounded. And I just don't know how this guy's going to react. But from what I have seen, he does seem pretty decently technical on the feet. His cardio seems to check out as well. And that may be enough for him to survive and pull off the win late. But ultimately, I got to go with the guy who's proven to be dangerous at the UFC level, even if it's only for one round, right? I mean, he hurt Dober really, really badly in that fight. And Dober, as we know, has gotten an insane shin. And he had Dober on skates early. He was able to cut through lower-level guys like Ziem and Gonzalez without much issue. And because I don't really know what level this Bonfim guy is, it's kind of hard for me to, pick him in this spot. So I got to side with the guy who I've seen murder guys at the UFC level. So I'll go with McKinney here to win by round 1 knockout. Obviously, in a lot of McKinney fights, he can probably safely just take the under 1.5. With how hard McKinney goes, he's either going to get you out of there or die trying. So I do like violence in the spot, like most McKinney spots. But official pick, I'll go with McKinney to win by round 1 knockout. And moving along, we have Maurício Ihor versus Ihor Potieria. And Potieria is the minus 190 favorite, who is the plus 165 underdog. And honestly, this is a fight that I don't have too much interest in. Who are obviously a veteran and a legend of the sport. But honestly, I think this guy's just completely shot right now. I don't think he's looked really any good in the past few years. He's technically 2-1 in his last 5 fights, but I feel like his performances really aren't as good as the record would indicate. I feel like it's very situational. He's even ended up with 2 wins and a draw during that span. I think he was kind of fortunate to run into opponents who kind of gassed themselves out. And, he also got a pretty good matchup in Nagura, another just very old aging fighter as well. But the sad thing about this matchup is Potieria is definitely the type of guy to potentially punch himself out early and, gas out in that second and third round, which is who has been able to win and draw in a couple of his recent fights, which really weren't that recent. They've kind of taken place like 3 or 4 years ago, which, is somewhat significant given the age of Hua. But in any case, Potieria is someone who does tend to start pretty hot. He's a pretty explosive guy. But we saw in his last fight, he will slow down pretty tremendously after that first round or so, and especially if someone's going to put the pressure on him. But the issue is, Hua I don't think he's got quite the durability and cardio that Negumereanu has. And on top of that, I just don't know if Hua's going to be able to really bring the pressure and the pace to really start to put it on Potieria, even if Potieria does start to tire out. Like, just watching OSP front kick him for 15 minutes in his last fight makes me think that he's not going to bite down and get into a firefight. I think he's kind of just content to potentially let a fight slip away, not take too much damage. So yeah, I'm going to go with Potieria here. I feel like at the end of the day, I just think that Hua's a little too shop-worn, potentially a little slow at this point. I really don't think Potieria is a good fighter, at least not at this moment. But I do think he's young and explosive enough to potentially find an early finish. So the pick is Potieria, and I'll take him to win by round 1 knockout. Definitely would not advise betting this guy at all, especially at chalk. I could definitely see him just punching himself out early and then kind of drop in the last 2 rounds. But official pick, I'll go with Potieria to win by round 1 knockout. And next up, we have Zara Farron versus Josiane Nunes. And Nunes is the minus 350 favorite, and Farron's the plus 285 underdog. And I'll keep this very short and sweet. Zerafirn is a terrible fighter. She has absolutely no ground game. The striking is non-existent. She's out here winging arm punches with her eyes closed. It's the most ridiculous thing I've seen, and I think she's going to get knocked out here pretty early. This is a setup fight. I wouldn't be surprised at all if Firn pulls out. I think she was actually supposed to have fought Nunes in Nunes' debut, but she ended up pulling out from that fight and also pulled out from 2 other fights. But if she does somehow make it to the octagon for this fight, I think it's going to be a round 1 knockout. Honestly, I think she's going to feel the power of Nunes and probably just shell up in there, and it'll be a pretty quick stoppage. So I'm going to go with Nunes to win by round 1 knockout. And moving along, we have Gabriel Bonfim versus Munir Lazzez. And Bonfim's the minus 180 favorite. Lazzez is the plus 155 underdog. And this should be a pretty fun fight. Yeah, Bonfim's someone who I consider an action fighter, someone who's very aggressive and will look to just box in the pocket with you. He's got power in his hands, but he does play a pretty dangerous game with how he likes to just slip and counter. He does like to float his chin out there, kind of draw out his opponents to strike and look to counter from there. He's definitely eaten some big shots as a result, and has been punished for it a bit. His grappling actually seemed pretty good as well. Appears to have pretty good awareness in scrambles, but overall it does look like he uses that more so reactively. I don't see him, very aggressively pursuing takedowns or anything. He does generally prefer to strike, and of course, the issue with these guys coming off of the Contender Series and having a ton of early finishes in their career, you do have to worry about the cardio a little bit, how they're going to look, past that, 6-7 minute mark when they aren't able to find the finish. But Bonfim, he does have a couple of round 3 finishes, but it is worth noting that one of the guys is 1-0 that he got the 3rd round finish against, so I'm not sure if you could put too much stock in that. And the other finish was actually in a fight where they were, for some reason, having 3-minute rounds. So technically he got the finish in under 7 minutes, which is still under a round and a half. And he also had 2 minutes of rest in that fight, between rounds 2 and 3. And also, in addition to that, he was actually slowing down a bit in that fight, was actually hurt pretty badly at the end of the 2nd round. In fact, it actually looked like his opponent may have punched himself out a little bit, which led to him eventually getting finished in the 3rd round. So I do think that there are holes that can potentially be exploited in Bonfim's game, and up against a guy in Lazzez who has shown 3-round cardio and is pretty solid volume striker. It could be a bit problematic, especially down the stretch. We have seen Lazzez be able to maintain a pretty solid output. He does churn volume out there. He does do a good job of working the kicks, constantly pumping something out there. And if Bonfim isn't able to get him out of there early, I could definitely see Lazzez start to pull away in the latter half of the fight. But ultimately, I do think that we see Bonfim find the finish in the early portion of the fight. I do have a bit of a hunch when it comes to Lazzez. I feel like he actually isn't all that durable. Definitely just going out on a bit of a limb here. But I know he survived early against Razak, but he really was just kind of resorting to shelling up and, hitting well-timed takedowns early in the fight. And once Razak started to slow down, he wasn't really in much danger. But I feel like Lazzez isn't really going to be able to get away with that here. I think Bonfim does a really good job of digging to the body, which I think is going to be really good against Lazzez, because I feel like Lazzez may be a little weak to the body. And on top of that, I think digging to the body is going to be a really good investment for someone who has a bit of a cardio advantage. So I do think that's something that Bonfim has working for him. On top of that, I think that if Lazzez is out there shooting sloppy takedowns, we could see Bonfim snatch something up. He does seem very slick on the ground, very good in transitions. So I do think that Bonfim can definitely find the finish early here. It would get really interesting if the fight got stretched out, but I think that with how dynamic Bonfim is, I do think we end up seeing him find the finish. So official pick, I'm going to go with Bonfim to win by round 1 submission. Actually, I think this is going to be a club and sub where we see Lazzez get hurt on the feet and he dives in for a reactive takedown. Maybe gets hit with a guillotine. maybe with a Darce or something. This Bonfim guy does actually have a decent amount of submissions on his record. So I'm going to go with Bonfim, and I'll take him to win by round 1 submission. And moving into the main card, we have Gilbert Burns versus Neil Magny. And Burns is the minus 400 favorite. Magny's the plus 330 underdog. And obviously, I think this is going to be a pretty rough fight for Magny, as the odds would indicate. Magny, someone who I would consider the ultimate gatekeeper, and I'm not saying that in a disparaging term or anything. Magny, he's someone who's, pretty consistent throughout his career. He's able to beat certain types of fighters, and he loses to certain styles of fighters as well. He's a tall, rangy guy who I'd say does a decent job of leveraging his size and skill set pretty well, especially against guys who aren't quite equipped to deal with his style, right? Magny's a guy who will look to kind of strike with you at distance. And, if you get in close to him, he'll try to clinch you up, put his weight on you, and work you in the clinch, work his grappling. He's got fantastic conditioning, and he does generally look to weaponize it. So if you're not able to keep up, he will eventually overwhelm you as the fight progresses. Magny's a guy with a pretty good fight IQ, and overall is just a very crafty veteran. But stylistically, I think he's in for a very tough one here against Burns, who I feel like offers a lot of threats for Magny, because with Magny, I feel like historically he is someone who's struggled with strong grapplers. He'll be the bigger guy in this fight, but this won't be the first time that Magny's been out-grappled by former lightweights. We saw Chiesa have success there, and even RDA back in the day, both guys who have fought at lightweight move up to welterweight and have a lot of success taking and holding Magny down, even pulling off the submission in RDA's case. And I feel like that is definitely a path here for Burns. And on top of that, Burns is a very explosive striker, which unfortunately for Magny is another archetype that I think he struggles with. I think Magny struggles, on the feet against guys who are able to get in his face, not give him space to really work, and kind of just, put pressure and heat on him. And Magny, in my opinion, does not react particularly well against heavy hitters also. So I think this is kind of a bit of a nightmare matchup for Magny. Not to say he can't win, but I feel like his path to victory is going to be very, very limited here. I think he'll have to likely stay on the outside, really use his footwork, but I don't think Burns is going to let him. I think that Burns is going to be able to land some pretty big shots on the feet. So I think the knockout is live. I think if Burns is able to take Magny down, he could find the submission as well. And, if the fight does somehow make it to a decision, I kind of favor Burns also. I think Burns is going to be able to land a lot of, very impactful shots. I think he may even be able to rack up some top control time. But overall, I do really like Burns in this spot. I think he could really get it done in any way. But as far as an official pick goes, I'm going to go with Burns to get the round 1 knockout. I think we see Burns try to start out hot and really put hands on Magny. I think him fighting in Brazil is going to be a bit of a factor in terms of his motivation to start aggressive. I didn't really mention it in any of the earlier fights, but I feel like fighting at home in Brazil for a lot of these Brazilian fighters, they're going to come out a lot more aggressively than they usually do. I think they're going to be extra motivated to put on a highlight reel knockout or finish for the fans, and I kind of see it happening here. I feel like there's going to be a lot of Brazilian fighters potentially, winning pretty spectacularly early, and I think Burns can definitely do it here. So I'm going to go with Burns. I'll take Burns to win by round 1 knockout. And moving along, we have Jessica Andrade versus Lauren Murphy, and Andrade is the minus 410 favorite. Murphy's the plus 310 underdog, and it looks like Andrade is continuing her campaign at 125, and I don't really blame her. I feel like a lot of the matchups there are a bit easier than, at 115. Andrade, as usual, is going to be giving up some size, at least in terms of the measurables, but I feel like she's got enough, strength and physicality to match most of the ladies there at 125, outside of maybe, 2 or 3 fighters at the top, but Andrade, very explosive on the feet, does a good job of leveraging her athleticism. She's quite well-rounded, honestly. Aside from being, a very explosive striker, we have seen her hit very explosive takedowns. She has a very good submission game as well. And on top of that, I feel like she's just in a very solid spot in her career where I feel like the skill set's really coming together. And, she's racked up quite a bit of experience as well. She's been in there with some of the best fighters across both divisions. She's reached the top of the sport. And on top of all that, I feel like she is in the prime of her career. She still is somewhat young. I think she's actually improving still fight to fight. So I do still think we have yet to see the best of Andrade, whereas on the other side, we have Murphy, who, Murphy's actually a decent fighter, but in a pretty weak division. And, she's kind of floated around in that top 15 and has been able to even make a title push, which I feel like was a bit of an overachievement, if anything. So Murphy, while I do think she's actually a decent fighter, has hit a bit of a ceiling. But overall, she's a very tough, very gritty fighter, someone who can kind of do a little bit of everything, right? She could strike, she could wrestle. She's a pretty physical fighter herself, but I don't think she's got quite the stopping power of a fighter like Andrade, and I don't think she's quite as dangerous or as well-rounded as Andrade either. So obviously I have to go with Andrade in this spot. I just feel like Andrade likely has the advantage wherever this fight goes. I just don't know if there's much Murphy could do in the spot to really threaten Andrade. I kind of favor Andrade in the striking. I think Andrade is the better grappler as well. So, maybe Murphy's able to hit takedowns and rack up top control time. She is technically the bigger fighter. She might be able to match some of the physicality of Andrade. So that might be a path, but I don't think that's super likely. I think we see Andrade likely dictating the pace of the fight and where the fight takes place. Andrade, I think, is going to be just having a ton of bigger moments in this fight. I feel like Andrade is going to be landing, bigger, heavier shots on the feet. And I think she's capable of just hitting like big takedowns, big explosive takedowns. So between the two, I just think that Andrade is going to have much bigger moments in the fight, landing shots, landing takedowns. And if anyone's got the finishing upside here, I feel like it's Andrade as well. Murphy, I know, has historically been pretty tough, but, she did take a ton of damage from Shevchenko, didn't react particularly well to some of the shots. And Andrade is definitely going to be one of the more explosive hitters that Murphy's gone up against. But in any case, even if the finish does not materialize, I think Andrade is going to have enough big moments in this fight to really swing rounds in her favor. On top of that, the judges and the crowd is probably going to have a bit of sway on the judges as well. So I'll pick Andrade here, and I think I'll go with her to win a decision. I think we see Murphy kind of tough it out, but I wouldn't be surprised if Andrade landed a big shot on the feet. But official pick, I'll go with Andrade to win by decision. And next up, we have a meme fight between Johnny Walker and Paul Craig. Walker's the minus 165 favorite. Craig is the plus 145 underdog. Pretty interesting fight in that we have a couple of, I'd say, pretty high variance guys going at it. Craig, obviously a submission specialist, but doesn't really have a super reliable way of getting fights to the ground, right? He'll look to pull guard. He'll butt scoot in there, but as we saw in his last fight, he does look a bit silly when he isn't able to pull off the submission. And historically, I feel like Craig is one of these guys who's been able to pull off these submission wins against guys who are maybe a little green, guys who also have maybe a little questionable fight IQ as well. And with Johnny Walker, while he is a bit of a meme fighter, I don't know if he necessarily falls into either category. I know he's had some, pretty dumb moments in fights, but I'm not sure if it's completely applicable to some of the fights that, Craig's been able to pull off. And as we know, Walker, typically how he loses is he's getting knocked out in there, but I just don't know if Craig's going to be the type of guy to really be able to do that to Walker. We've also seen Walker struggle a little bit, with the takedowns, especially later in a fight as he starts to slow down. But again, I don't know if Walker or if Craig is going to be the guy to really capitalize on that either. Craig, not a fantastic wrestler by any means, and Craig is someone we've seen slow down pretty significantly in fights also. So I feel like this is going to be potentially a pretty sloppy fight if it does get past that first round and a half. But as far as this matchup goes, I think the big question mark here for me is just how the submission defense of Walker is going to look. I know he did recently get that submission win over Kudalaba. But outside of that, he hasn't really shown too much grappling in his arsenal. The guy's either getting, quick knockouts or he's getting knocked out quickly. We haven't really seen him tested in the grappling realm too much, especially not against a guy on Craig's level, right? But if I had to pick a side here, I'm probably leaning more so on the Walker side. I'm taking a bit of a leap of faith in assuming that he'll be able to stay safe and stay out of the submissions early. But I can't say it with a ton of confidence here. I feel like overall this is a pretty volatile fight in that I do think that both guys are kind of live for a finish. I think that on the feet, Walker does have a pretty significant advantage in terms of the striking, and Craig obviously is very dangerous off his back, but we have seen him kind of, fall off a bit after that first round and not be as dangerous in terms of the submissions, past that first round and a half. And I also feel like it's kind of volatile in terms of the over-unders as well. While I kind of favor the under for this fight to hit just because, both guys are pretty dangerous early, I also think that if this fight does get past that, 6-7 minute mark, it's going to devolve into a pretty sloppy affair, pretty similar to the Oezdemir fight, where, both guys looked kind of tired in there. Craig, who was trying to make something happen, but, just didn't quite have the strength or the cardio to really convert. Both guys were also getting pretty sweaty in there, so it was probably hard for him to really tighten anything up. So I do think that, maybe someone gets finished early in the fight, but I wouldn't be surprised if this fight, creeps past the 6 or 7 minute mark for it to go the distance. So official pick, I'm going to go with Johnny Walker. I'll big brain it a little bit and say Walker wins by decision, but I think the early knockout is pretty live as well. But official pick, I'll just go with Walker to win a very sloppy decision here. And in the co-main event, we have the quadrilogy between Davison Figueiredo and Brandon Moreno. And this fight is lined at a pick'em, currently minus 110 both ways, and rightfully so, I'd say, with how closely and evenly matched these guys have been in their past few fights. And it's kind of been split right down the middle, too, in terms of some of the results as well, right? Because we have two pretty high-level guys, each with a pretty decisive win, and the third fight being a really close one, right? Figueiredo, I'd say, won the first one somewhat decisively. I know it was a split decision, but I think he won, I'd say, like 4 of the 5 rounds. But the second fight, we saw Moreno, get the submission win. So, 1-1 each with a pretty decisive win. And then the third one was just a pretty close fight where I feel like Figueiredo kind of edged it just based off of, the power shots, the knockdowns. But overall, it was still a very close fight. And usually when you have these rematches, trilogies and even quadrilogies, in this case, I think the breakdowns get a little more narrative based than they are, technical, I'd say. But, as far as this fight goes, I feel like the narrative is going to be pretty similar to the third fight. I don't think the dynamics have changed too much between the two. I think we have a guy in Moreno who is still coming into his prime. He's still looking pretty sharp lately. Whereas with Figueiredo, he's kind of aging out of it, if I'm being honest. 35 is honestly kind of old for the division. And on top of that, he hasn't really been all that active. I think he's kind of struggled a bit with injuries as well during this time. Even for an elite level guy like Figueiredo, I feel like it is still a bit concerning. If both guys were in their prime, I would probably take Figueiredo, but he is a little older now. He has taken a year off, whereas Moreno was able to get a fight in, stay sharp, stay ready in there. The weight cut, I don't think, is really getting any easier for him, for Figueiredo, that is. But between the two, I just feel like there's maybe a higher chance that we see a slightly more diminished Figueiredo than we do a diminished Moreno. But stylistically, I think that Figueiredo, he's going to have the power advantage. He's also going to be the more physical guy. But Moreno, he's going to be the guy with better volume and cardio, I would say. Moreno's a pretty tough guy as well, but it was a little concerning seeing him get dropped 3 times by Figueiredo in that third fight. And, he did take a bit of damage from Kai Kara France. And, I'm not going to say his durability's, gone or anything, but, that's a lot of damage he's taken, over the past 3-4 fights. And coming into this fight, it could be it could have like maybe a psychological toll on him, in addition to some of the physical tools he's already accumulated, like being dropped 3 times by Figueiredo. I feel like maybe he might be a little more tentative to engage, which I think is definitely going to be detrimental to him, because I feel like for Moreno to really have success in this fight, he's going to have to make it a very dirty and scrappy fight. And what I mean by that, he's going to have to kind of get in the face of Figueiredo and make this a really grueling fight for him. I think he's going to have to really he's going to really have to mix in the clinching, the cage pushing, and even the grappling, because at distance, I feel like while Moreno is going to have the cardio and the volume advantage, he'll still end up eating the heavier shots, and I feel like that just won't be a very efficient use of his cardio, in my opinion. I think he's going to have to go in there and really look to dictate the pace and really make Figueiredo work in there. You got to make the older, more muscled up guy who's cutting a ton of weight really work in there to really exert himself. If you're letting Figueiredo kind of just pick his shots at distance and conserve his cardio, it's going to be really hard to pull away in this fight. I think that's kind of why he lost that third fight. He let Figueiredo just kind of do what he wanted in there, and he wasn't able to put a stamp on any of the rounds, whereas I feel like Figueiredo was able to win the rounds a lot more emphatically with some of the heavier shots he was landing. And I feel like a way to really mitigate that is to not give him that space to work, really tire him out, and kind of take some of the juice off of those shots by really working the grappling and the clinch work. And maybe even try and do more attritional work with like the body shots and stuff too. So I feel like if Moreno is able to do all that, he can definitely win the fight here, on top of the fact that, I think that, career-wise, we have a guy who's entering his prime as opposed to another guy, maybe leaving his prime at this point. Now, the question is if Moreno is going to make those adjustments, and obviously I have no idea. Moreno, not exactly known for, his fight IQ or game planning, I don't think. But ultimately, I think I'm still going to pick him to win here. I think I'm going to go with Moreno, the more youthful guy who's been able to keep it pretty competitive. And I think with a few proper adjustments can really swing the odds in his favor. So I'm going to go with Moreno in this fight to win a decision and win the quadrilogy, and hopefully close this chapter of this matchup. I really would like to see some other matchups for these guys, but official pick, I'm going to go with Moreno to pick up the decision win and become the new champ. And in the main event, we have Glover Teixeira versus Jamal Hill. And this fight is practically at a pick'em, minus 110 both ways. I think you could get a little variation on different books, but for all intents and purposes, this is a pick'em fight. And this is a very exciting matchup, in my opinion. It does seem a little forced and might not be the best for the light heavyweight landscape. Hill, I think, getting a little bit of a fast track here, and Teixeira supposedly looking to retire after this fight, which, win here would leave the belt vacant again, so would make things a bit interesting for the landscape of the division if he were to vacate. But in any case, this should still be a pretty fun fight. Two guys who I would consider finishers going at it with two very different styles as well, right? Hill, obviously, more of a striker. He's a pretty good boxer with very quick, very crisp hands. He's shown knockout power, but I still think that there still are some holes in Hill's game, and I would say that he's still even a little green, at least in relation to the magnitude of this matchup, right? You don't see too many 11-1 fighters make it to a championship level fight. On top of that, he's only had, I'd say, 1 5-rounder scheduled, and I don't think he looked particularly amazing in this fight, or in that fight. The cardio was still a little concerning. It was a big question mark going into it, and I don't think he really answered those questions really well. I think the 5-round pacing is probably still a bit questionable as a result. Obviously, the takedown defense and defensive grappling, still a lot of question marks behind that, right? So overall, I feel like his game does need a lot more polishing up. It's undeniable. He's got power in his hands, and he is a very dynamic striker, but I do still think that there are still a lot of other holes in his game that need to be addressed here. Whereas with Teixeira, a lot more well-rounded, a ton of experience against higher-level guys and going into later rounds, but obviously, the downside to that is going to be the age, the wear and tear, which I feel like does definitely add to the volatility of this fight. Obviously, Hill is a very dangerous striker, and I can definitely see him hurting and knocking Teixeira down early in this fight. probably more than once, right? And I feel like this could be a fight that could really just come down to if the ref is going to let Teixeira be a warrior in there. Like, I can see a scenario where Hill is got Teixeira hurt pretty badly, and he's kind of teeing off on him, and Teixeira is scrambling in there. He's trying to get in on a single, trying to get his hands on Hill, try to get his grappling going. But this could be a situation where the ref steps in and just waves off the fight, or he could let Teixeira kind of just try and fight his way back. Given the history of Teixeira, him fighting in Brazil, this being his retirement fight, maybe he lets him kind of fight on a little bit, and this absolutely could be a scenario where we see Hill kind of punch himself out and Teixeira kind of coming back and pulling off a late submission like he's shown he could do in a number of his fights. So I feel like there are a few scenarios on the table here. I think the margins are kind of thin on both sides in that regard. I think you can make a pretty clear argument for both sides. Teixeira, while he has shown, an ability to come back into fights, it's undeniable that he's taken a ton of damage in his last few fights. Just looking back at his fight against Prochazka, he took a ton of heavy shots. They were definitely affecting him. He got knocked down by Santos. Before that, I think Smith was kind of teeing off on him early. He was getting hurt by guys like Roberson. So the chin of Teixeira is going to get hit in this fight. He's going to get cracked. The question is, if you think Hill's going to be able to put him out cold, or if the ref is going to let him try and fight back into this if he's not completely out cold. So, it's kind of tough in that regard. But if I'm leaning aside here, I got to go with Teixeira. I got to go with the crafty veteran who's shown he can come back in fights, who can fight through that adversity. And on top of that, while I feel like both guys will have an advantage in their respective areas and are dangerous there, I feel like there's going to be a bigger gap on the ground than there is on the feet. If Santos, of all people, was able to hit takedowns on Hill and have as much success as he did on the ground, I'd have to imagine that if Teixeira is able to take him down, he'd have a lot more success, potentially even find the submission. So I'm going to go with Teixeira here. I mean, he absolutely can get starched early in this fight. Hill is going to be, I think, much quicker, much more explosive. But, if he isn't able to get that knockout, I'd say in that first round or 2 rounds, I do think that we see Teixeira start to kind of come back later in the fight, get his grappling going. And on the mat, I do think that Teixeira's got a much bigger advantage than Hill does on the feet. So official pick, I'm going to go with Teixeira. I'm going to go with Teixeira to pick up the round 3 submission.